right. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon for this amazing training that it's a training series. Thank you all for everybody on Facebook that is tuning in as well. We welcome you to please place any questions or comments on Facebook. I will be keeping an eye on that. And thank you so much for supporting this and attending this training. For those of you that have registered for this training, just wanted to let you all know you are in a meeting-based training, so please be aware of the mute, unmute button. And if you have any questions or concerns, please use the Q&A and also the chat. You are more than welcome to also take some time to introduce yourself. We would love to know who is joining us this afternoon. The topic for today for our first discussion/training is defining coordinated community response. And we're so grateful for David for creating this training and this series. And so with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to you, David, since this is your training, so you can introduce our amazing panelists and get going with this training. Thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you, Terry, and welcome everybody. I am really delighted to welcome Rebecca Tomford-Hauser and Nida Abbasi from the Center for Court Innovation, who are here today really to kick off this whole series. Today is the first of the 7-part series, focusing on various aspects of the coordinated community response. And our friends from the Center for Court Innovation will be kicking it off with the focus on the entire CCR. So Rebecca and Nida, I am delighted to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. And while I'm doing that, Nida, do you want to introduce yourself to everybody?
Sure. Thanks, Rebecca. I'm Nida Abbasi. I work with Rebecca a lot at the Center for Court Innovation. I've been there for about 6 years. I'm the Associate Director of Court and Community Initiatives. So I do a lot of work on how courts and communities can work together in enhancing their approach to domestic violence, sexual violence, stalking, dating violence. And yeah, we do a lot of trainings just like this, and we go into communities and do strategic planning and all sorts of stuff we'll tell you about shortly.
Okay, great. Let me just move this around so I can get to the place that I need to get to on my thing. I'm so sorry.
I think you can hit the button on the bottom that looks like it's like the closest one to the sliding slider all the way to the right. It looks like a little presentation. Do you see that icon? Next to the minus sign.
Wait. Oh yeah, here we go. Thank you. There we go. Yep. Perfect. All right. Thank you, everybody. Sorry for that. So I'm Rebecca Tomford-Hauser. I'm the Director of Community Accountability and Engagement for our Gender and Family Justice team, and work with NIDA to help support communities around the country looking to enhance their response to gender-based violence. Both of us work at the Center for Court Innovation, which is based in New York City. At the moment, I live in Vermont, so I'm streaming in from Vermont. And Nida, you're still in Chicago, right? Is that where you're meeting us from? Yeah, so the center has folks working all over the place right now. And we're excited to be with you virtually in New Mexico. I just wanted to give you a little background on the Center for Court Innovation. We work to achieve justice and equity, create safe, healthy, and thriving communities, and ultimately transform justice systems. We do this through our operating programs to test new ideas and solve problems. We perform original research to determine what works, and a lot of times what doesn't work, through our attempts enhancements and reform and community-based responses. And then we provide training and technical assistance to justice reformers around the world based on the work that we've been doing. So the Gender and Family Justice team, I'll turn it over to Nida, and she can tell you a little bit about the work that our team does.
Yeah, so our team specifically helps courts and community-based agencies and organizations and individuals respond creatively, holistically, and effectively to all types of intimate partner violence, so domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and dating violence. And we do that through a number of strategies, like I mentioned, strategic planning. We facilitate team meetings, we host trainings and workshops. And one of our most requested topics is actually coordinated community responses, what they look like, what they do, how to get started or improve if you already have one in place. And then this is what most of our team that does training and technical assistance looks like. So we keep growing, but this is most of our TA people. We come from professionally diverse backgrounds. So there's a bunch of lawyers, social workers, former advocates, and people who've done policy work. And then these are the values that we try to promote throughout all of our work with sites and communities. So just so you know, we're trying to be as intentional as possible with each site, and we are happy to provide both general and individualized support.
And we're happy to be with you to kick off this training series around coordinated community response. I was excited to see all the folks that you will be hearing from after us. And so our goal with you today is really to define coordinated community response. It's a word that we all throw around a lot, especially in the grant writing world. We're often talking about how we want to enhance our coordinated community response. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that might mean. We'll also highlight some national strategies that we have learned from folks around the country for collaborating around accountability, safety, and well-being. And then we'll give you all time to work with each other and talk about what some of the values are that you bring to this work and the strengths that you see in your individual communities when we're thinking about a coordinated community response for New Mexico. So with that, we've got some poll questions, and I'll turn it back over to Teresa for poll number 1.
So the poll asks,
yeah, go ahead. No, you do it.
Do you have a coordinated community response in your community? And the answers are yes, no, or I don't know. And we'll just give you a few seconds to respond to that.
Great. It's interesting. It's looking like, I don't know how it will change. I feel like the person on CNN who is looking at the polls is like constantly managing what's happening with elections, but looks like almost half of the folks are saying that they don't have a coordinated community response to DV. Interesting. Okay.
And half are saying they do, which is very interesting.
Yeah. All right. It's interesting. I would have thought more people had one. So this is great. I'm glad we're doing this so that we can talk about what that might look like for your community. And those of you who don't know, this might give you some beginning steps to think about what it could look like for you if it was something that you wanted to start. Okay, great. I think we have another poll. Let's see. Good, so we can share the results here. Everybody can see that. All right. So about more than half said no, that they didn't have one. Of those who do have one, or know if they do or don't. All right. Good, so let's go on to poll number 2 and see what the responses are there. So the second poll, are you a member of the CCR in your community if your community has one? Great. And folks on Facebook Live, if anybody's there, you can just put that into your messaging too, if you want to answer if you are or aren't member one. Okay, so again, let's end the poll here. Then I'm going to share the results. This is very interesting as well. So the majority of you who have one in your community are not a member of that CCR. Okay, great. Good. So that's good background information for Nida and me as we move through these discussions with you all. So right now we're actually going to take some time and break you, put you into the breakout, some breakout rooms. And what we want to do when you're in the breakout is answer these two questions. So we'd love it if someone in your group would be willing to just take some general notes. Again, you don't need to transcribe the whole conversation, but some general themes that are popping up for you in your group. And we want you, and we'll put these questions into the chat so that you'll have them as you go into your breakout. So the first question is, what do you care about in your community, right? And that can be anything, whatever comes to mind. And then the second question is, in what ways do you see domestic violence harming your community? All right, so first we want to just talk about the things that you care about. And this is you as a human being. Doesn't need to be you as an advocate or a probation officer or law enforcement or a judge or a program provider, really just you. So, my answer as Rebecca Tom Ford living here in Vermont, I really care about the environment and making sure that our beautiful landscape is able to stay beautiful. So that's just something that I care about in my community. All right, so Terry's gonna help us put you in some breakout rooms. We would love one person to just take some notes, and then we'll come back in to discuss those. And what do you think, Nida? We're thinking 15 minutes?
Yeah, maybe like 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. So we'd love it for everybody to have a chance to participate. We're gonna keep the breakout rooms a little bit smaller, I think, around 6 to 8 people. So you'll have plenty of time to discuss really the things that you care about, and then the ways you see domestic violence harming your community. Okay, and Nida and I may be popping in just to see how things are going. We'll see you in a few minutes.
All right, I opened up an extra room, which is room 8 for our panelists, just to let you all know.
Okay.
Rebecca, just so you know, and Nida, just so you know, we have, looks like 3 people who are also joining us on Facebook Live. Hello, people on Facebook Live.
Okay, so it looks like everybody's back in. So I am going to share my screen again. There we go. Perfect. So yeah, so Nida and I would love to hear from you. Would someone from one of the breakouts like to just share maybe 2 things that came up in what you care about in your community?
I'm Diana. I was in group 4, and we kind of shared how getting more knowledge out to law enforcement about domestic violence was very important to us. And then it maybe reaching out to like younger generations, like the youth, about what DV actually is. That's kind of what we all kind of agreed on, 2 small topics that we talked about.
Great. So those are 2 things you care about in your community. Great. I like that. Kind of you're already there thinking about ways you can collaborate. Any other group want to talk about some things that you talked about around cares, things that you care about in your community?
We talked about some really good stuff. We were talking about some of the important things about community is that that's where we get to learn, and then where we get to share what we learn, and so clients get to learn from us. And then we were talking about how important it is to create a trusting environment, and an environment that's really not stigmatized, and about how to ease into those types of conversations about what's going on in the community. And then we were talking about how it affects the community. And of course it's the immediate victim, but then there's this, generational trauma that goes on where people in the community keep learning the same way to deal with problems. And because of the stigma and because people are embarrassed to talk about it, it's hard for us to reach the topic. So we were talking about ways to make it easier to get in to talking about it, and being creative about getting the family together and getting that trusting community feeling so that people can start sharing about what's going on. And then they will be open to the ideas that we have, our evidence-based ideas, to change their beliefs and help improve their behaviors.
Okay, great. I love what you said there at the beginning too, around communities are a place where we can share and where we can learn. That's really powerful. Great. And you dove into the second question, but does anyone, before we move on to that one, someone else I think might be trying to share?
This is Johnny. We were in group 7 and with Brittany, Mercy, and Ernest, and some of the challenges Ernest pointed out, being the only BIP or one of the only BIP in a Pueblo community. Brittany shared challenges, and we all agreed that the time that it takes, the time it takes an individual to get into a BIP program, it's sometimes over a year from the offense, because the courts, there's been such a delay in getting them adjudicated. And, and I had brought up some of the ways that we have worked with the courts and the attorneys to get them into the BIP program sooner. And that was, not only is it a challenge, but it doesn't make any sense that it's taking so long for an offender court case to get before the bench and then him get into the program. And, in some cases it was over 2 years before they were ordered to the batter's program from the time the incident occurred.
Okay. So it seems like I'm hearing that you care about having a response, and you were talking a lot about some of those frustrations and the challenges you have in providing services to people in your community. And
it was the accountability element, the victim, the disservice to the victim of having an offender get into a program 2 years after, or even a year, even 6 months is too long to get them into the program that they need. It's just not, it's a horrible disservice to the victims that, you know, they have to wait so long for remedies of their situation.
Yeah. Great, thank you for sharing. Anyone talk about ways you see that kind of helps us lead us into the second one? How do you see domestic violence harming your community? Any idea, anything you want to share with the larger group from your discussions?
This is Javier Argueta, Metro Court. I don't know what group number we were in, but we did discuss that. We talked about how it harms kids and how it can destroy the family unit. As you know, it affects kids horribly as they see and hear a lot of things. There's also that financial aspect of, with the breakup of a family unit, there's a chance that one of the parents or both parents might be thrust upon getting onto public assistance and so forth. So, and we also talked about how it's generational and how unfortunately, they see it growing up, and before you know it, once they start dating in their teenage years or even later on, it starts, there's a possibility that, those learned behaviors will, before you know it, start coming into their own relationships and so forth.
Great, thanks. Any other group want to talk about the ways domestic violence is harming the community? We heard there about the impact on children and harming children.
I can say, Rebecca, we also talked about, I was in Johnny's group when we were talking about batter's intervention, and of course, breaking up families in custody, me being in a shelter. But we also talked about the impact on the individual level first and then the broader society. So substance use is a big deal for survivors who are going through that as a coping mechanism. And then when they come into our shelters and facilities, they'll come in with substance use disorder or with other mental health concerns like PTSD, not always necessarily, but just kind of mentioning that in thinking of the coordinated response. A lot of our shelter staff are not mental health professionals, are not substance use counselors, don't have that training. And aside from a psychological hospital or a crisis triage that can take them for 24 hours down here in the South, there's not a lot of room for where someone would go.
Great. Thanks so much. Perfect. Nida, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. So based on the conversations you just had in your breakouts, you of course identify the ways domestic violence is impacting and harming your community. So now we want to look at how working collaboratively across professions can hopefully help address those harms. So before we get deep into the material, something to remember is all of us get a really small window into what's happening in a domestic violence case. And a lot of times we're not seeing the exact same thing, like every profession isn't seeing the exact same thing. So an advocate might get different information about a case than a judge, who might get different information than law enforcement. And the way that those different professions and those individuals might think about domestic violence is going to be different based on how their agency handles these cases, and then also based on your own personal beliefs and experiences. A lot of domestic violence is not necessarily against the law in a lot of places, especially if it's not physical or sexual violence or threats. Which can be really tricky for systems to deal with these other types of violence that you can see on the power and control wheel, which might be a little hard to read, but we can maybe send it to you afterwards. But oftentimes survivors and their kids, their families are dealing with these other categories of abuse, like economic abuse, using the kids against a parent, being gaslit or being called names, being isolated. And they're still in danger and still need protection, even if they're not dealing with severe physical violence, which makes it all the more important to have a coordinated community response that can represent all the different types of things people are dealing with in your community.
Another way you can think about it is, how can our coordinated community response enhance evidence-based practices? And a lot of system players are thinking about, what does this mean? Actually, some courts are moving towards evidence-based decision-making. Probation officers and probation departments are moving to evidence-based decision-making as well. And so when we break down the pillars of evidence-based best practice and put it in the context of a CCR, how can you come together with your community partners, with your criminal and civil legal system partners to think about risk assessment? How can we collaborate around risk assessment? How can we collaborate around programming and making sure that there, as you were saying, Johnny, that if we have programming, the referrals are coming in a way that's actually increasing safety and not causing maybe a safety concern? How can we deter future violence from happening? How can we lay out the principles of procedural justice and enhance folks' sense that the system and processes and community responses are fair, that they're being heard, that they have an understanding of what the resources are and what the system practices are and what the process in each system is for them. And then how can we enhance our collaboration? And what's nice about collaboration is that there's actually research that supports the efficacy of programs and specifically criminal legal responses that bring a wide variety of stakeholders together to come up with a response. And a lot of that research is out of the drug court model. But what they found is when there was a diverse group of stakeholders creating those drug courts, that those drug courts were actually better able to reduce recidivism, which is one of the goals of evidence-based practice. Oftentimes, and Nida, do you want to talk about ORCID? I feel like you are familiar with this story.
So this is about what are the harms that we create through different types of interventions if they're not effectively or properly planned. So ORCID is a survivor of domestic violence who went through the legal process in New York City, and she shared her experience, her story, as part of a statewide testimony to change the way that New York handles domestic violence cases. So this is what she had to say. In 5 years in the court system, I had 14 separate cases in 7 different courtrooms before 7 different judges. I'm not only a victim of domestic violence, I'm a victim of the court system that is confusing, unfriendly, and dangerous to victims. So we just want you to think about whether this is something that you think could happen in New Mexico, and what type of message is it sending to victims when they have a domestic violence incident. Maybe it's tied to like a divorce or child custody situation, and it takes this many years to resolve it. They have to keep going back to court. They have all these different cases, and they really just feel confused and victimized by the court system. So it makes it really clear why a lot of people end up dropping or withdrawing their cases.
And I think one thing as a coordinated community response you can come together and think about are like, what are the harms our system creates in trying to respond? Like Johnny, you were saying, we have a system where there's a referral to a batterer program or an abusive partner program. The issue is that it took an entire year for that person to get in there. So like, what are the harms that we're creating when we don't have a system that really can be response in an immediate way. Or Brittany, you were talking about you know, the harms of drug and alcohol abuse. And so just thinking about, you know, how can we manage those harms without creating more harm by mandating people to programming and then they fail out and then they're in jail or whatever the case may be. So really thinking about the system responses. And I know you're going to be hearing from Jim in a few weeks, and he often talks about this as well. So we won't belabor it too much more, and you can stay tuned and listen to him as well.
Okay, so why is it important to coordinate in domestic violence cases? So you just saw an example from New York for why it might be really important to make sure you have a coordinated response to DV cases. And these are just some of the things that it can help with, some of the priorities, enhance the safety of the survivor, of any children, of the overall community, if everyone's on the same page and communicating on domestic violence cases. It can also help address some of the community harms that you all talked about that are caused by domestic violence. We see that a lot with communities that do have an effective coordinated community response in place where everyone's on the same page and communicating. It helps the overall response and starts helping with some of these larger systemic harms that are happening. It also increases abusive partner intervention and engagement. So Rebecca's more of the expert on this topic, but there are a lot of different communities that are trying new things with interventions and engaging the person who's causing the harm to try to get that behavior to stop rather than immediately going to something punitive, because we know people can be punished and then go right back to doing what they were doing before. So spreading awareness and education about different initiatives and new research that's happening, making sure that the survivor is centered in the way that the community is responding to the domestic violence and prioritizing their needs and their families' needs. Again, increasing just overall community awareness of a lot of people don't know, like outside of our field, don't know even basics about DV. There's a lot of times no reason for them to know that professionally. So if there's some way of increasing community awareness of DV and what the best practices are in responding to that, and then finally making sure that litigants have the greatest access to justice possible when they're on these cases. So what exactly is a coordinated community response? A lot of you probably already have an idea. The definition is kind of in the phrase itself, but to be really specific, it's a multifaceted yet collaborative approach that works towards one goal: enhancing community-based responses to intimate partner violence. So lots of different agencies, individuals working together to improve the way that systems respond to domestic violence and make sure survivors and their families are safe and the people who are causing harm are being held accountable for that harm. So no matter what kind of coordinated community response model you have, they generally contain all these elements that you see on the slide. So set policies and procedures that teams usually come up with together, so there's greater buy-in on those policies and procedures. Stakeholder engagement, so making sure that anyone who touches a domestic violence case has the opportunity to participate in the CCR. Information and resource sharing mechanisms, so nothing important gets lost on cases and you're constantly communicating with one another on things that are going on in your community. And training, of course, to keep everyone on the same page and so people can exchange ideas and learning with their peers. Something we're getting a lot more interest in from different communities is making sure that there are culturally responsive practices in place to ensure that the CCR is aware and sensitive towards all the groups present in the community and the specific barriers they're dealing with and their specific needs. And then finally, data monitoring to make sure you know what's going well, what needs more attention overall. And then again, there's a lot of different ways that sites can go about creating their own coordinated community response. But something that's important to each one is that the members and the agencies they belong to have a commitment to the goals of the CCR, which also require commitment to establishing shared values around responding to domestic violence, understanding each other's roles, and then developing some kind of concrete plan to improve the response of different institutions and agencies to DV that's realistic, that's measurable, and that's sustainable.
So when you hear the word CCR or coordinated community response, oftentimes people think about the Duluth model, or you may hear people are like, oh, we have the Duluth model in our community. And so we're not going to spend too much time on it because we hear that Scott Miller is going to be with you for a while to really go talk more in depth about the Duluth specific approach. But we certainly can't talk about a CCR without giving credit where credit is due to Duluth, where they really, the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project piloted a CCR program back in the 1980s, really to respond to this increase in DV cases coming into the criminal legal system. And so they brought, you know, a lot of the criminal legal partners together with community-based advocates to think about how can we address primarily two things: abusive partner accountability and engagement, as well as survivor and victim safety. And I think what Scott Miller may touch on is that over the years that has expanded and changed as they've redefined what a coordinated community response means for them and for their community. And what I think is most exciting is out of that collaborative relationship that really created trust among and between all of these partners, they were able to create a restorative justice response for high-level felony domestic violence offenders, where they run restorative circles for those men as part of a criminal disposition. And so I think that's really an exciting way to see how models and responses change over time, again, to keep the community in the coordinated community response through listening and understanding what survivors are asking for, what they think will keep them safe, and then understanding what the needs are of the people who are causing harm through IPV in their community. And we can talk too, just since we mentioned the restorative approach, I think thinking about community-driven responses, you know, it's important to note that many communities around the country are using some type of a restorative approach to address intimate partner violence. Our office did a study a few years ago and surveyed programs around the country to get a better understanding of what they were doing. And we can share that link with you in the chat in a little while. But if you're curious about what that might look like as part of a coordinated response, we can certainly share that with you. I'll say that in Vermont, they have piloted the Circles of Peace model, which is something that you know, came out of a Native Indigenous response to how harm was being addressed in communities. And so they're using a peacekeeping circle approach to addressing harm caused through IPV. And so it's really exciting to see that happening in Vermont and modeled after the Circles of Peace. So Nida.
Okay, so let's debrief some of this through a short scenario. We can think about the role CCRs play and what gaps it can fill. And this fact pattern is based on an actual case that I think happened in California, but some of the details are changed. So the police show up at Lee's home after her daughter calls 911 during a domestic violence incident between Lee and her partner. Lee knows some English, but she's reluctant to talk to the police. The last time they told her to go to court and file for an order for protection, but she was confused by the process and did not return for the hearing. Lee is worried that her partner will get into serious trouble if she goes to court. She does not want him to end up in jail. However, she's also feeling very isolated and wants the abuse to stop. So we will do really quick a polling question. Does this seem like a situation that would happen in your community? And the answers are yes, no, maybe, other. And I'm not sure if there's a poll ready for this one.
Right.
We might have missed this one. Maybe you can just.
It's we
Okay,
have
you can
the
just drop
polls,
it in
but
the
it
chat
looks
box.
like somebody just like mine. So Rachel, if you could try the polls for me, that would be great.
It seems like people are responding in the chat box, so that's
Yeah.
fine too. We can use that. Almost all of you are saying yes. If you think no, please write, or any other response, definitely write that as well.
All right. Yeah, we're getting a lot of yeses.
We're getting almost all yeses, or all yeses.
Okay, good. Well, not good, but we've got consensus on this. All right.
Okay, so we just wanted to ask you a couple of questions now. Are there any issues specifically that stand out to you about this fact pattern while I was reading it? Anything that popped out? And if you want to write in the chat box, or if you want to unmute yourself, either is fine.
I'll just put it back up. So what are some issues and concerns you've got?
We see a lot of this here in Socorro where the victim does not want the offender to really be, go to jail, go to prison. But we earlier in the year, we got some really great training on a perpetrator pattern-based approach. And we've taken this and we've used it, gone to law enforcement, gone to the judges, and became the voice for the victims that even they're a part of this, but they're not responsible, and kind of get a shift away from the failure to protect approach that we were seeing, and it's kind of turned things around, and we're now seeing the CCR, and one of the things that developed from this is some tremendous training that was offered to our CCR group just a couple of weeks ago from Quentin McShane and Sheila Lewis. We set it up. They came in and they gave training, and the response from law enforcement, everything that came to us was just was great to see that our community response team was willing to go ahead and first take the training and address the issues such as this, and let them hear the victim's voice on why maybe they don't want to call law enforcement, or why they're reluctant to follow through on prosecutions. So it's kind of opened a lot of doors with our CCR members.
Great, and we love hearing when trainings are going well and people are getting more and more information on these critical issues. Thanks for sharing that. Anything else that you're seeing in this fact pattern that's jumping out at you?
It would have to be the order of protection in the process.
Being confusing. Okay, so order protection process. We can move on to the second question. How do you think a coordinated community response would help in this situation?
Johnny gave us a good example of how his CCR is responding. Any other thoughts on, if you don't have a CCR, why you'd like to come together with other folks, what you'd like to talk about if Lee was a survivor in your community?
Some of the things that are happening is she seems confused. Maybe she can't communicate as well as she'd want to, or ask clarifying questions. She clearly has these worries that we just talked about criminal intervention, and she's feeling very isolated. Perry says training, education, and getting people on the same page to reduce victim blaming. Great.
And then how about
Anything
comprehensive community support services?
Yeah, comprehend. So, is there anything going on in the community? Are there any services that exist, especially culturally specific services? Because we see that she has limited English proficiency, so maybe, there's another language she's more comfortable in. Is there anywhere else she can turn that could provide support to her?
I'm wondering too if a CCR could help address what Amanda brought up around the confusion around the order of protection and her not wanting to get one.
Lack of legal information. Is there like an advocate at the courthouse or an advocacy agency that could help her? Would she be eligible for a legal aid attorney? Is court staff trained on what types of legal information they can provide within the confines of their role? Albert said having a DV advocate meet with the victim after the incident so that they can thoroughly explain the procedures in seeking a protection order and answer any questions maybe she has that she's worried about. Something else going on here is she has a child involved. We don't know exactly how old the child is, but is the abuse having any impact on her? Is that something to be concerned about or look into more? Does she need support?
This is David. I just would add a couple of things here. The way this is written makes me wonder if the police made a police report, and it doesn't sound like it. I mean, I'd like to think that there was a police report made. And if there was, this feels like it's going to go into the next question where the victim is asked, do you want to prosecute? Which I think is just a terrible question. And it's actually an erroneous question because prosecutors prosecute, victims don't prosecute. Prosecutors do that. And yet we've kind of made some strange language around, do you want to prosecute, available to have as part of the conversation. And I also think, really you mentioned about the daughter and the 911 call, that is, I think there's a lot of ways that when kids make 911 calls that we should make them heroes and give them some, like I remember as a kid going on an airplane and the pilot gave us a little pair of wings that were metal back in those days. These days they're plastic for kids, but just some kind of recognition that, if we came together as a community and talked about this case as you have it here in the scenario, those are the things that stand out that haven't already been mentioned.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for mentioning all those details too.
Hey, another thing is maybe a conversation with the victim that the perpetrator taking accountability and responsibility doesn't mean that they're going to lose their job and have to be in prison. That taking accountability and responsibility will end up getting what she asked for at the end, which is that she just wants the abuse to stop. So taking accountability and taking accountability and responsibility doesn't mean he has to go to jail necessarily. It means that he has to go to counseling and change his thoughts and his beliefs and the way that he behaves, and that will get her what she wants. Of course she's afraid because he might not see it like that, but
yeah, and exactly what you're saying. And every case varies from situation to situation. Sometimes the person wants to leave, but they have other issues they're dealing with, like housing or finances, where it's just making it really difficult, or if they have language access issues, it could add to their anxiety. So there's a lot of details that are missing here that we're not totally sure what's going on, but you all mentioned a lot of great things that stand out in ways that coordinated community responses could try to uncover some of these details and get to the bottom of what could be helpful in this case.
Yeah, and I think to David's point too, if the police aren't called to the scene, then I would wonder what are the resources for her in the community. As Nina was mentioning, it seems like, is Lee a member of a faith community? Is she a member of some kind of culturally specific organization? What are the resources there and the understanding in those places of ways that they can support Lee? And then I'd want to know too, it seems like the child was afraid for Lee's safety, but what are Lee's concern about her own safety? And is a protective order something that would keep her safer? Are there other things that she needs that are like immediate concerns that would, want to keep her safe? Like, is she afraid? Is she a citizen of the United States? We don't know that. So like, how would this impact her immigration status or that of her husband?
One more that I'd want to add that I think would come out if we did have a CCR meeting, we were talking about what are the barriers for this survivor to obtain resources, and that it sounds like if we have a process that's confusing, like trying to get a protective order, then we need to figure out ways to make it less confusing. We need to find ways to make it less of a barrier to get that. Imagine if we had voting laws that, you had to do these 3 different things and take a bus downtown and get childcare and find parking, and then you could register, but you had to bring these types of ID. We'd want to limit how confusing it was in order to promote access to the system.
Yeah.
There are, David, there is a statute. It's fairly general that officers responding to a DV scene are to give out information to the victim pertaining to shelter. Now, Albert brought up a real good point. We have advocated in our CCR, and the officers will ask the victim to call our hotline, or if it's okay, that they'll get a number and we can call them. And what we do, because the victim is so overwhelmed in this crisis situation, she doesn't know the services or the ramifications or any of the other particulars surrounding this case. So when she's able to call in and talk to our advocate, it does a lot of things, because I probably, in over half of the departments in the state, I would bet, would not have documented this very important case. But yet when we're able to do it. And down the road, when you need a date, when you need a time, and you need to go back and ask for that video that the officer now has to have on that IPRA request, we now have something to base it on. So there's a lot of things that are happening really fast. But what seems to have worked, and officers are trying to get in, get out. Sometimes they don't even get to the scene. And they love the fact here that they can go ahead and get our victim crisis advocate in contact with the victim as soon as possible. That, and our victim advocate will spend a lot of time explaining orders of protection, the criminal proceedings, the detainment, the arrest, because it is so overwhelming at that point, and they don't have that information that is, it's life and death. It really is the information that, that they're providing at that point, could save the child or their life.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. All right. So it seems like if you had a coordinated community response in your community, there'd be a lot that you'd be thinking about in order to help provide safety and autonomy for Lee, which is great. And you have some resources already on hand, it seems like many of you are talking about. So again, just to reiterate some of the things that we've been talking about. I think really this sense of ongoing communication is something that you were all talking about. So making sure that we really know what the needs are for Lee and what the gaps might be in your community to provide the support that she and her child need. Thinking about where are the underrepresented groups in our community? Are they accessing the services? Are they coming into court? Are they not coming into court? And figuring out why that might be. And then thinking about some of these unintended consequences. What are the consequences for Lee of going into to meet with the police or participate in a criminal legal process if she is an undocumented person living in New Mexico, or if her partner is an undocumented person living in your community. So this is what I was saying before, you know, people may say, oh, why are you going to that CCR meeting? And you can say, I am reducing recidivism, which is always something that criminal legal stakeholders are interested in doing. And so it really is a way to obtain buy-in, to have more folks at the table, to begin to have these conversations around why we should collaborate, why we should start talking about the impact IPV is having on our community. And then to be thinking about who are the partners, who are your community partners. Here are some examples. I don't know if you all have other ideas, folks that we're missing. EMTs, they're often on the scene as well. Any other ideas?
A lot of communities are like trying to integrate healthcare workers and professionals more, which are not like traditionally involved in CCRs, but a lot of times they do get insight that you wouldn't normally get in other parts of the legal or justice system in DV cases.
Right. And I think what Brittany said, you know, going back to that around the impact of substance abuse, or the impact of IPV on someone's mental health, why someone may be using substances. So inviting in folks who aren't necessarily experts in IPV, but who may be seeing those people in the community. So substance abuse and mental health providers. All right. So Nida, do you want to talk about this a little bit?
So in this last part, we're going to think about ways that you can work to enhance some of you have a coordinated community response and some of you don't. So either enhance it or get started on making one. So we're going to specifically look at two of the strategies that are listed on here, conducting a system analysis mapping, and then also identifying shared values. But of course, there's a few others, and there's a lot more too, but there's a few others listed on here, which is creating a mission and vision together, coordinating the exchange of information and interagency communications, so making sure everyone's communicating between agencies, identifying the resources that we'll also talk about this, identifying some resources that are already present in your community and what you need to develop, and then finally evaluating responses based on the impact that the CCR is having.
So one thing we often do with communities is system analysis mapping. And so this is a really great way to start strategic planning and bring people together to walk through the system as a survivor or in this case, a criminal defendant. And this is just, this may be hard for you all to see, but this is, we kind of created a generic template, right? And then we work with communities to think at each of these stops, the 911 dispatch, when you think about Lee, right? So Lee's daughter's calling 911. Then law enforcement may be called, then they arrive, et cetera, et cetera. You can go through that and you can ask all different kinds of things. What are the resources available to the defendant, to the child, to the survivor at each of these decision-making points? You can ask about what risk information or risk assessment is being used and how that information is being shared. So at each of these stops along the way, there are many, what agencies are involved potentially with the defendant or the survivor at each of these stops along the way. So here's an example of a criminal. We have templates for a civil, we have a template for a child protective process. And then here again, keeping the community in the community, coordinated community response, thinking again with places of worship, with work, with schools, with a hospital or healthcare setting, substance abuse, whatever those community-based agencies are that may be interacting with families in so many different ways, culturally specific service providers, or even, like the German American League or whatever those culturally specific social gathering places are, then thinking about, okay, where might they be making referrals? What information might they be getting? And where are there opportunities to invite them or to provide training around IPV? And we'll just do another example around, we're actually going to go through a process with you of breaking you out and talking a little bit more about your shared values, because that's really an important place to start when you're coming up with a coordinated community response. And I don't think we have it here, but I know that we do have an example of Ann Arbor where David is from. They came together and their Judge Libby Hines, talked about cussing and discussing. There was a lot of discussion about what the role of this CCR was going to be, what the limits are around it, and really helped focus that group of people and build trust so that they could have frank and hard discussions around the impact of IPV in their community.
I think the slide was supposed to come. I think I mixed it up, but yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's fine.
Should I do it? Okay. Should we break them? We'll have them break out and then we'll do some Jamboarding. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Great. So what we want to do is to break you out into breakout groups again. They don't need to be the same group. Terry, if you didn't set it up that way, that's fine. So we're going to have you zoom back out into smaller groups, and we want you to identify shared values. And so first we're going to ask you just to think for a moment to yourself, what is one value I bring to this work? And a value is really like the way that you approach this work to IPV, right? So one value I bring to this work is humility, right? Because I do not know anything about what's happening in anybody else's life. So I really want to learn from those most impacted, right? So thinking about a value that you bring to your work with IPV. So we want to see if you can think about that. You can get into your group, just spend a minute or two. You can jot some things down if you want, and then share that with your group. In the meantime, we'll be setting up a Jamboard. I don't know if any of you have ever used Jamboarding before, but we'll be sharing a link with you when you come back in from your breakouts, and you'll be able to use a little mini Post-it, a virtual Post-it note, to write down some of the values that you came up with in your breakout group. So first, a moment of silence, thinking about a value that you bring to this work. Then in your group, you can share that with your group. And we want to see if in your group you can, is there a shared value or two? Maybe you can come up with 3 shared values from your group. Something that you can all agree on. Yeah, we all share this value to bring to the work. All right. So let's see if you can do that in your small group. We'll give you about 10 minutes. You're going to think to yourself, you're going to share your value out, and then you're going to see if you as a group can come up with 3 shared values. And we'll come back together. I think, is that, I'm seeing the chat in here. Nina put it into the chat. What's one value you bring to your work? When we come back, we'll have a Jamboard. And if you don't know how to do Jamboard, that's fine. We'll let you put stuff in the chat and we'll Jamboard it up there. But that way you'll be able to see these sticky notes. And we'll see if as a group, a diverse group from across New Mexico, if we can come up with some shared values that we bring to this work in IPP. All right, so let's do it.
All right, perfect. I'm going to go ahead and open these rooms and I will, as usual, send you a notification. So it is 2:21. We will return at 2:31. The rooms are open and I, again, have a panelist room as well.
Great. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Looks like you're zooming in here. Great. All right. So I don't know if by a show of hands, I see a lot of you don't have your pictures on, so maybe you can use the raising the hand feature. By a show of hands, how many of you have used Jamboard before? Either raise your hand or, yep, okay, good. Looks like we might have some Jamboard novices. So Nida, great. So Nida just put a link into the chat. You see the Jamboard Google. And Nida, should I let you? Yep, you've started sharing your screen. You're a step above me. Great, or ahead of me. So you can click on the link in the chat and it's actually going to take you into this Jamboard. And let Nida take it from here and she can explain Jamboard to you. If this seems overwhelming or you can't do it because you're zooming in from your phone or whatever, you can also place some of these answers that came up in your group into the chat. So yeah, Nida, do you want to explain Jamboard a little bit to folks?
Sorry, I was talking and I was on mute. Okay, so people are already putting sticky notes, so we have some experts. So basically you'll just, if you can see my cursor, the little white hand, you'll just hover over this thing that says sticky note, pick a color, write your value in here. I'll just put value and hit save, and you can add more if you want, if your group discussed more than one, and then just put it anywhere on the Jamboard, and then I'll try to organize them into segments once we get some of them on there. And if you want to just drop it into the chat box, Rebecca or I can just copy and paste it into here. But we have a few already. So we got compassion twice, empathy, and compassion, of course, go pretty close hand in hand. I'll just give you a minute to start writing them in there and then we'll talk about them.
And for those of you who are new to Jamboard, this is a great tool if you haven't used it already to be able to use in your groups. It's free. It's part, if you have a Gmail account, it's part of your Gmail. All you have to do is set it up and then share the link, and you can do what we're doing right now during your groups.
Good. And Nida, Kathy put in the chat listening and empathy.
Great. I see one of you put accountability as a text, so I'll just change it to a sticky note. I'm trying to change this, but I'm hiding
accountability just wants to be there.
It's gone. Okay, I'll put the header again.
Great. We're seeing respect is on there now.
I just want to put this in the middle so we know what this is about.
Okay. Great. Anyone else want to share? If you can't put into the chat, I think we're a small enough group, you can unmute yourself and just say one of the values.
And I'm just trying to group them a little bit.
Yeah, safety, good.
Some of these are like related, but not fully the same.
Right.
So I think some of these, like understanding, not judgmental, listening, they're kind of all getting to creating a safe space for the people that you're working with. Autonomy is an interesting one. Passion to do this work. Yeah, this work is really hard, so it's good to have a drive to keep doing it every day. Empowerment, great. Okay, any other things that you all talked about? Does anyone want to expand on any of the values that they added in here? Or anything interesting that you shared in your group conversations? Okay. I will stop sharing this so that Rebecca can share the PowerPoint again, unless Rebecca, you have something you want to add about the exercise.
Okay, great. So any thoughts on these values for folks? Anything that surprised you, or now that you're looking at it, anything that's missing? All right, I just want to, okay. So Nita, you want to stop sharing? Okay, here we go. Someone's saying, I chose connection because I grew up in a family where DV happened. So I know how it shaped my life. Thank you, Ernest, for sharing that. Anyone else want to share? Okay. Yep, compassion. Got that. Noted. Okay, so Nita, do you want me to start sharing my screen again?
Whichever, I can share the PowerPoint too. I can just stop sharing this window and then go to the PowerPoint. Okay. If I can remember which slide we were on.
I know, here, I can just share it from mine, it's fine. Let's see, it should go right to it. Here we go. Okay, great. All right, so any questions that came out of the anything else on the values that you want to share with the group? I think it's a really good way to beginning to start having a CCR and having a conversation about what are we doing as a group together. And it's great that you have those things about being active listeners and compassion around safety and accountability. I think those are great places that you can all build on in your individual communities. And if you do have a CCR, I'd be curious, you know, if you know what your CCRs, do they have a mission statement? Do they have values that guide the policies and the procedures that they're advocating for, or that shape what they're going to do together as a group. I know many of you may not be active participants in your CCR. Maybe someone else from your agency is the representative to that, but I encourage you to go back and see, you know, does your CCR have a vision and a mission statement, so that we can, you know, so that you can use that to build buy-in, and then make sure that anything that you as a group are doing is tied back to that mission and the vision. It really keeps you cohesive as a group and allows you to prioritize things and move through issues or respond to issues, discuss issues in a way that you can keep going back to those values and staying true to those values. And that's good that many of you put down active listening or I'm a good listener, because sometimes it's hard to have those discussions in a collaborative way. All right, so let me go back a second here.
Okay, I thought it was in there, but maybe it disappeared. We had a slide that was just on another strategy that you can use in your community to try to get started on some things, some ways that the CCR could be helping. So one strategy is called asset mapping, and it's more of like a strengths-based and people-based approach to uncovering what assets exist in your community rather than like going to like a weaknesses approach where you're looking at what is going wrong and what gaps are, because we know sometimes that can be really stressful and hard if you're looking at it from that approach, even though we know everyone is dealing with gaps and problems. But if you're looking specifically at assets, that can include any resources, relationships, any structures that you currently have in place that can meaningfully contribute to safety and to healthy communities. So for example, if you identified that there are people from specific demographics in your jurisdiction that don't seem to be using the court system or seem reluctant to use the system at all on a domestic violence incident, you might think about what kind of assets and strengths already exist in your community, like we talked about culturally specific service providers, and then make space for them, for those providers to provide their expertise and to be part of the CCR. Something that we've seen other communities do is there was a community in Minneapolis or Hennepin County, Minnesota, who realized that they had a huge Indigenous population in their county and the surrounding areas that just were not coming to the family court at all. And the chief judge is part of one of those communities. So she really wanted to figure out what was going on historically and if there were any current barriers. So they had like listening sessions where it was just open for people to come in and talk about their experiences with the court and give some ideas on what the court could do just immediately and then long term, so they can make space for those communities. Another common example is community-based service providers might not fully understand what judges can and cannot order in DV cases, while judges might not always account for all the complex issues that make the court process difficult and even inaccessible for survivors, which I think a lot of you have mentioned. So asset mapping is something that's going to help your site figure out ways that existing resources can help bridge those issues through better communication and education.
Great. And another way to enhance your coordinated community response, or something that you can do if you're starting a coordinated community response, is really think about this idea of self-accountability. A lot of times we're focused on, is the person who's causing harm through IPV accountable to what they're doing? But really holding yourselves accountable as agencies coming together, accountable to your mission and vision. And some ways people do that is through this evaluation of your responses. Is what we've come together to do helpful? Is it enhancing safety and autonomy for survivors? Is it providing needed services and accountability for people who are causing harm? Is it increasing access to information and access to justice for litigants if their cases are, if you're focused on your criminal or your civil legal response? And so thinking about what those performance measures might be, how do you want to come together to evaluate yourself? What are the strategies that you have in place to ensure that your CCR is sustainable over time? Nida and I have been doing some work with some CCRs around the country and really thinking about how can we re-energize ourselves as a CCR? How can we bring new members to them? What does leadership mean in the context of a CCR? What does sustainability mean? So we don't lose our focus or lose momentum, lose participation over time. So those are ways that you can evaluate and be self-reflective in your work to keep things alive. And again, to keep that community in your coordinated community response. So I think with that, we just wanted to open it up into any questions that you all might have. Anything that popped up for you, anything you'd like to learn more about that might help David and Terry and Pam as they're prepping the folks for the next part of your coordinated community response series. Any questions? Seeing something in the chat here. Let's look. All right. Yep.
That was just for me.
Okay, got it.
I would say that it's not a question, but just in relation to what I posted there. I don't remember if it was CCI that was the technical assistance early on in the JOD project with back in those days. But one of the things that happened is they had us go to a very remote place where cell phones didn't work. And they never told us that it's their intention for us to not have our cell phones, but it created an atmosphere where we were really forced to talk with each other because we couldn't get calls from other people or we couldn't make calls from other people. And I always thought that was, whether they did it or not, they should have at least claimed responsibility for intentionally putting us in that position to really prompt the conversations.
Yes, that wasn't us, but that is a great idea.
I have a general question. Does anyone, or do you have a position on MOUs for CCRs in your area? What's your position on them? I have some general questions on something that I've encountered, now because of, Senate Bill 8 in New Mexico that mandated a lot of things at law enforcement, and then now also the ban on qualified immunity for law enforcement. So I don't know, have you experienced much success in getting these MOUs established, or are you a proponent or against them?
Interesting. I don't have enough information about MOUs as part of a CCR. That's not something that has happened in the states that I've lived in or in many of the jurisdictions that we've worked with. I do know that it has come up as someone did bring it up recently, and I'm trying to remember the name of that state so that I could get some more information for you about like how they handle MOUs, but I don't have enough information about that. Nida, I don't know if you.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any like legal or whatnot implications, but I could see why different communities would be interested in having that, just because then you have it kind of like memorialized and it's like an official commitment, which, we talked about how important it is for people to be very committed to the CCR. So I could understand why it's come up, but yeah, I can't think of any specific examples.
I could give a couple examples. It's I think it is something that is more recent for communities to have that. I think it is in line with explicit consent and kind of a almost like a prenuptial, if you will, just given the relationships that come with the CCR. But I think one of the benefits of it is it creates something that can live past people, which I think is really a good thing, given that people change in jobs and move or are promoted, and this can be something that creates an infrastructure that can live past this individual's name who's going there. But I also think that it may be somewhat of an outgrowth from what happens oftentimes with the child advocacy centers that do create MOUs between all of the partners about what they're going to do. I'm not 100% sure on that. That's been an assumption of mine as I've watched the Child Advocacy Center kind of on the clock and how they're growing in popularity and function, and in many ways might resemble a CCR when it comes to domestic violence.
You know, David, I believe Albert is still maybe with us from CYFD.
Yes.
And on page 20, now we can bill for CCR activities. And if you look at the definition in our standards for BIP, the first thing it says is establishing formal agreements, memorandum of understanding with courts, prosecution, law enforcement, survivor service agencies to coordinate services around DVOTI programs. And that's written into our contracts. And I didn't know if anybody now, you know, I'm having some pushback, and, you know, even though we have our CCRs in place, but those MOUs, given the current temperature of what's going on in New Mexico, there is, you know, even if you talk extreme orders of protection, you can't even get all the sheriffs to agree on enforcing or, you know, utilizing those tools available. So I didn't know if anybody had been successful, if Albert knows of anybody that's been, you know, successful. I did send an old one. I sent you a copy of one from Bernalillo and Sandoval County. They have an MOU, and it talks about mission and purpose, and it looks great. But I didn't know if anybody else was, you know, getting the pushback that we're seeing in our area.
Albert, what say you? He may have had to step away. Pam or Terry, from a coalition standpoint, any input on the idea of the MOUs?
I will let Pam go first, and then I'll follow.
Okay. Pam, you're muted if you're speaking. We're not sure.
I know some people had to hop off, so
yeah,
since we're close to that, she might not be there.
Terry, if you have more you'd like to add, I welcome you.
I will say, I mean, just on a person, this is just my 2 cents, that if you can keep the CCR grounded in a community response, like, and again, have clear principles and values and objectives, that can allow you to do a lot of things. A lot of times CCRs, like David was saying, are specific, like, we are going to talk about cases as they pertain to whatever. We are going to do X, Y, and Z. I know in New York State, it's caused a lot of problems because then judges cannot be a part of a CCR if they're kind of seen as advocating for a certain thing, or if they're going to be discussing cases or reviewing cases, if they don't have the defense bar present, those types of things, if they're not taking minutes. So I think it is important to figure out like what the ethical constraints are for each of your partners, but then there may be then those specific meetings could happen in a different way in Vermont, it's also part of their standards that the program providers have to be, part of a CCR, but there isn't an MOU that the program has to have with the CCR saying what they do or don't do as part of that meeting.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Well, we're coming up on time to oh, Terry, were you gonna?
Yes, I was just gonna support that. I think it's important to have an MOU, but also kind of what you said, Rebecca, and just really having these meetings and really starting to create awareness on the community engagement to really get things moving, right? This is a series. This is one of a lot of, sessions that we're gonna have, and I think just coming together and really connecting with our community to ask what we really need to make those changes and really get that support. Johnny, please feel free to reach out to us how we can support you. If you're getting pushback, just let us know. And, we are having these meetings for a reason. And so thank you, David, for creating these and continuing and really having these conversations, which are very much needed.
And with that, Rebecca and Nida, I want to thank you and the center for letting us have you for these couple of hours and for your sharing your wisdom with us, which comes from coast to coast. You covered it from Vermont to California. So we are grateful for your assistance and look forward to any time that we can continue our work together. And on behalf of the coalition, I thank you, and we're very much in your debt.
Well, thank you. Yep, and I registered for everything, I guess, so maybe I'll be sitting in on the other ones as well. So we'll look forward to potentially seeing you all on the other ones as well, yeah, but great speaker lineup.
Great.
And that is correct. If you did register for this and you are on our webinar, you are now registered for all the rest of the series. So you will get reminders and updates. There is no re-registration required. Do not worry if you lose your link. I will make sure that you have it the day of and the day before. So you can please join us for the future ones. But if you're registered for this one, then you are registered for the rest of the series. And let us know if there's any questions or concerns so we can support you all. And thank you all for everybody that joined us on Facebook. Please feel free to share this series. And we hope to have you join us on the webinar and or Facebook in future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.